One of the profoundly interesting bits of video game history back in the 16-bit era was how the various home consoles handled their ports of Street Fighter II. The Super Nintendo was famously the first console to see a port, and I gotta admit, it was pretty special. I remember all my friends wanting to play it, with my best buddy Nathan scoring it fairly quickly. And boy did he absolutely wreck me with his Blanca, or Blanca as we called him back in those days. For weeks and weeks this dude would annihilate every single fighter I tried to play with, driving me absolutely insane with his trash talk. I did eventually get better, but that stretch of time really sticks out in my memory. Of course, when Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition landed on my Sega Genesis, I loved playing it with that sweet 6-button arcade pad Sega released with it. Aside from those scratchy voices, I loved every second of it. But for most of us in the West, there was another console Street Fighter II we only heard about in the gaming magazines. This one was on the Japanese PC Engine, which was known as the TurboGrafx 16 where I lived. Unfortunately for me, it was never localized here, so it was much harder to experience than the Super Nintendo or Genesis ports. Not only was the game itself 9,800 yen, but you also needed an adapter, which tended to add quite a bit itself. With that said, I thought it would be nice to give this one some attention, all its own, to see just how the old PC Engine did with this classic arcade fighter. Was it a weak 8-bit conversion unworthy of the name, or did it stand its ground as a true 16-bit success story? I hope you guys enjoy my review of Street Fighter II Champion Edition for the PC Engine. Normally in the gameplay section, I give you a quick overview of the story and explain the gameplay a bit. This is Street Fighter II Champion Edition, and the majority of you know it well. Instead of doing the norm, let's talk a bit about control. When the PC Engine released in 1987, it had just 2 action buttons on its gamepad. Back in those days, it was pretty standard in fact. With most game design being fairly simplistic, it would stay that way for a few more years. The funny thing there is that even though a port of the first Street Fighter existed on the platform, you still only ever had a 2-button option. In 1991, NEC did expand a bit and offer up the Avenue Pad 3, a new addition to the PC Engine family that put a 3rd action button on the face of the controller. This was only a half measure, however. That 3rd addition was simply a remapping of the select or run buttons, essentially offered up to make certain games a bit more comfortable to control. When Street Fighter II Champion Edition was released, this simply wasn't good enough. So it was that in 1993, NEC released the Avenue Pad 6, a fully featured 6-button controller with a slow motion switch, rapid fire, and a compatibility toggle to make sure all your old games worked with it. It was released right before Street Fighter II hit, just in time to make sure everyone had what they needed to get the most out of the game. NEC wasn't the only company that welcomed Capcom's hit with a new play option, because Hori dropped the Fighting Commander PC. Yeah, take a look at that sucker, because it's basically a freaking 6-button face Super Nintendo controller for the PC Engine. Hori even went one step further by offering arcade junkies a decent alternative with the Fighting Stick PC, which had a quality at the time well above what you typically saw at home. I'm telling you all this because to enjoy Street Fighter II on the PC Engine, you needed one of these options. That meant you had a nearly $100 game to import, plus a region converter, and a new controller to buy. Import gaming was no joke expensive back in those days. As for how Street Fighter II Champion Edition plays with these options, pretty damn good I must say. Though it lacks the speed options of the Genesis and Super Nintendo releases, your punches and kicks are responsive, and every special move comes off snappy and without a hint of slowdown or stutter. This easily plays as well as the Genesis and Super Nintendo offerings, so don't let a meaningless label like 8-bit misguide you into thinking that this is somehow inferior. This plays faithfully to everything you know and love about Street Fighter II Champion Edition. The characters are here, the stages look the part, and when you drop a dragon punch on your friend just at the right time, that same feeling of elation will course through your veins. This is Street Fighter II Champion Edition on a console released in 1987, nearly 5 years before the arcade original even showed up. I'd also like to share that this is one of the most approachable versions of this game in terms of difficulty. On the easiest 1-star difficulty, the CPU is a cakewalk, and you'll get the full ending to the game. This is perfect for beginners to get a feel for the mechanics while still being able to enjoy the story. On its highest setting, the AI can be nasty difficult, so veterans have something to look forward to as well. It rounds out with the standard versus mode options, but you'll need a multi-tap to enjoy 2 players.
Round 2, fight!
What many of you want to know is how this version looks next to the other options available at the time. Capcom put this on the largest hue card ever made, 20 megabits of pure arcade power. And beside the arcade, you have to admire the work that went into this. You get great color representation, sprites that are smaller, yet mimic each and every fighter right down to their unique physiques and the costumes they wear. The backgrounds are equally impressive, nailing every set piece you've come to know and love across the game's many locations around the globe. The only real drawback here is the lack of multiple background layers, which does make things look flat compared to the arcade and the other available console versions. Fortunately, the line-scrolling floor is still intact, so all is not lost in regards to faithfulness. Another drawback comes in the form of lots of animation frames being sacrificed due to the card size. 20 megabits was a decent size for a home game, but the arcade was of course much larger. You'll notice many background animations sacrificed completely, and many of the moves for the fighters have been greatly simplified. I do think that this compares well to the Super Nintendo and Genesis home ports in this regard, however. Next to the Genesis, I actually like the color on the PC Engine a bit more. I think the backgrounds especially benefit from the expanded range of the hardware, though that lack of layering does stick out like a sore thumb. Even next to the colors of the Super Nintendo, the PC Engine is still a warrior, holding its own in detail and an overall competitive showing against the other 16-bit offerings. Let's do a few stage comparisons so you can get a better look. The sound and music here is represented well. There are some instances where speech will be dropped due to 2 special moves being performed at the same time, but otherwise it's very nice. That voice work is vastly superior to what we received on the Sega Genesis, but the stage music is easily the weakest of the 3 console versions available at that time. Don't get me wrong, this stuff still sounds good, I just prefer the Genesis music more, with the Super Nintendo tunes coming in a close second. I have found that this is certainly a matter of preference, however. Your tolerance of synth-based tunes will likely have a massive effect on your opinion, so let's have a listen and see what you think. In a direct face-off with the other console versions, I have nothing but respect for the PC Engine version of Street Fighter II Champion Edition. It looks good, sounds good, and plays fantastic. And when comparing this to the other ports, it comes down to the smallest of details as to which one gets the nod for the best version. None of these three are bad in any sense of the word. Your preference for the small details plays a pretty prolific role in how you may feel about these games. For me, the PC Engine conversion is a competent, well-designed release that is more than enough to get a solid review and recommendation. And when compared directly with the Super Nintendo and Genesis, the ratings fall like this for me. Visually, I give the PC Engine version second place behind the Super Nintendo. While the color is very nice, it lacks the layered backdrops. This does make a difference and impacts the game for me, particularly since both other options have the layers fully intact. The PC Engine gains back some ground when it comes to sound effects, however. The special move voices here are quite a bit better than the scratchy samples you hear on the Genesis, and very close to the quality on the Super Nintendo. That lands the Genesis version dead last in this regard. Unfortunately, I do not feel the same way about the music. It's here that the PC Engine slips the most, and I rank it third behind the other two. The Genesis music is the easy winner here, with the Super Nintendo still besting the PC Engine quite easily. As far as the gameplay is concerned, the PC Engine really does tie both the Super Nintendo and Genesis editions, but it does lack the turbo speed seen in those releases. I don't have any issues playing the slower speed, but without even the option to play faster, the other versions just feel a bit more complete. Honestly though, all those opinions and critiques come off sounding much worse than they actually are. It's only when you break it down to the smallest details that there is actually anything really to complain about. Taken on its own merits and as a representation of the arcade original, the PC Engine more than gets the job done.
Round one, fight! Hadouken! Shoryuken! Hadouken!
I honestly can't stress enough how impressed I was with this the first time I played it. Take away all the arguments of the PC Engine being just an 8-bit console, and you still have hardware released in 1987 doing an arcade game this well from 1992. It's 20 megabits used to its fullest potential, and shows you that the platform had more than enough power to compete with both the Genesis and Super Nintendo. In fact, had the TurboGrafx had a game like this a few years earlier in the US, things may have turned out much differently. Of course, by 1993 that battle was long since over. That kinda leaves the PC Engine version of Street Fighter II Champion Edition here as little more than a curiosity for those of us in the West. It was impressive seeing NEC's little powerhouse pull it off, but it didn't really matter much. We had options available elsewhere, and they had more features. And that's the PC Engine in a nutshell for you. Lots of interesting stuff in Japan, which very little of showed up elsewhere in the world. Games like Street Fighter II Champion Edition showed its capabilities, an excellent port that's very much worth playing today. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.